You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Happy Monday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And come on over to Odyssey Radio to look at all the goodness that is Odyssey. Check out the schedule, see what kind of listening enjoyment and entertainment there is for you throughout the entire day. And at the same time, if you're listening to this broadcast live and you're anywhere near a computer, you can go over to YouTube and listen to the simulcast of this broadcast. Actually, watch it in video over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And I think you can go to Scotty Roberts, and it takes you to the same place. And while you're there, you can join the chat room. All the Intrepheads are gathered over there, and you can join in the conversation, add your 2 cents worth, and really start to discover the family of Intrepid listeners that are out there. And so thank you for being here tonight. And as promised, I am going to continue my what would you call it? It's not a reading. It's a reading in a way, but my giving to you the account of a man's encounter with the Jinn. And this is a man named Hank Wesselman, PhD. I don't know what his PhD is in precisely. Let's just see here. I'll give you a little bit about this author and who he is. Hank Wesselman, PhD, he's a research paleoanthropologist. Whew, that was a mouthful. Easy word once you got it down, but just looking at it on the screen, I had to work it out there. And Hank Wesselman is one of those rare, cutting-edge scientists who truly walks between the worlds. He did his undergraduate work as well as his master's degree in zoology at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and then he went on to receive his doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley. Now, I want to tell you something about these guys that seem to straddle both worlds. I have in my very dear friend John Ward and his wife Maria Nilsson. They are scientists, they are anthropologists, they are archaeologists, and they work a dig, as you know, an archaeological site in Egypt, down about 100 miles south of Luxor at Gebel El Silsila, an old quarry site. And they've been working that site for a good 10 years now. And the interesting thing about both of them is, as Maria told me once before, and I don't think she has any problem with me mentioning this, and I think I've mentioned it before. After one of my experiences in Egypt, the one at the tomb of Senenmut, that guy sitting over my shoulder there, the bust, she said to me, she says, Scotty, in her sweet little Swedish accent, she said, here, she says, I am an academic and a scholar. And she said, back home in Sweden, I am a witch. And so you see there are people who have gone into these fields, these scientific fields of anthropology, archaeology, history, and things like that, but they also straddle both worlds in that they are aware of the other side. And while people like Maria and John can't speak about this in great detail, well, hardly any detail at all, when they are doing their archaeological work and appealing to the academic community, in private you catch them and they are people that are just as involved with the other side of things. And so I've said they've always straddled both worlds. And as this author, Wesselman, says, he straddles both worlds. He's a native New Yorker. He spent much of his time living and working among traditional tribal peoples, primarily in Africa and Polynesia, and he served in the Peace Corps in the 60s. That dates him a little bit. He's a little older than me, probably 20 years older than I am. And it was there in the Yoruba tribe that he first became interested in the indigenous spiritual wisdom. And since 1971, now I was 11 at that time, so that gives you an idea. Since 1971, he's conducted research with an international group of scientists exploring Eastern Africa's Great Rift Valley in search of answers to the mystery of human origins. And during this time, he's worked alongside such worthies as John Johansson, Lucy's discoverer, Professor Tim White, whose expeditions have been featured in several Time magazine cover stories, as well as members of the famous Leakey family. And he's one of the primary investigators involved in the discovery of the Ardi sites. That's the Ardipithecus remedis, and in Ethiopia. And he recently revealed to be which was recently revealed to be the famous missing link, quote unquote, between humans and apes that Charles Darwin predicted would be found in Africa. And Hank's research is involved with the paleo-environmental reconstruction of the sites, 4 to 6 million years old at the time that they were laid down. And he's also a shamanic student. He's a practitioner, he's a healer, and now in the 28th year of his apprenticeship, a 28-year apprenticeship. That gives you an idea of what's involved in becoming somebody who has those kinds of abilities. And I think what's important about reviewing this about the author is that when we talk about this conversation that he had with the Jinn, it lends a little more credibility. He's not just some, and pardon this for anybody out there who fits this bill, some whack job out there with no degree, gee, that sounds like me, who experiences things but also works very hard to stay within the scientific framework. But there are some of these things, like we said, that science cannot pierce the veil. And so there are it's almost like two roads he's walking at the same time. In addition to Wesselman's scientific papers and his monographs, his books include the autobiographical trilogy Spirit Walker, Messages from the Future, Medicine Maker, Mystic Encounters on the Shaman's Path, and Vision Seeker, Shared Wisdom from the Place of Refuge. You know, it sounds like I'm giving a biography for somebody I'm going to interview, and I would love to interview him, and I think we just may in the near future. Now, these unusual books of his are focused on a series of altered state experiences that began spontaneously out of the bush of Africa, and they document his investigations into a hidden reality that most of us haven't even heard about, but few have experienced directly. And I want to say about that there is a whole world out there of things that go beyond what we think we know and believe. And once you even step a toe over the line into that arena or into that realm, you find that you can be overwhelmed very quickly, as I was, with that other side of things that sweeps in and can be very consuming. And in Wesselman's explorations of these inner worlds, he may have also provided us with a glimpse into the possible evolutionary future of humanity. Now, that kind of stuff for me is a little tough to grasp onto because it's predicting something that hasn't happened yet. But this, of course, is based on, it's like I say in the Tarot, when you see a future reading card, that's a card that's establishing the possible future path based on all the energies that have led you up to that. And I think that's probably the tack he takes. And so he combines this sober objectivity of a trained scientist with a mystic's passion and a passionate search for deeper understanding. And his books also contain revelations of the generally secret teachings of the Hawaiian kahunas. Now, his smaller teaching books include The Journey into the Sacred Garden, a guide to traveling in the spiritual realms, and Spirit Medicine, Healing in the Sacred Realms. And that was co-authored by his wife, Jill Kuykendall. There you go. Now, his newest book was co-authored with Sandra Ingerman, is Awakening to the Spirit Worlds, the Shamanic Path of direct revelation. Now, this came out 10 years ago. That's one of his later books. And Larry Dossie, MD, has described Hank Wesselman as an expert guide who fully realizes that he's playing with scientific and spiritual dynamite. You put those two things together, and you're going to gain a lot of critics, a lot of naysayers, and at the same time, you're going to see somebody who has opened up certain doors that a lot of scientists will not go through. And he currently lives in Hawaii on Kona, and they're involved in sustainable food production on their farm in Hanaunahuanahua. And he continues to write and teach workshops across the country and abroad. That's a little bit about the author, and I wanted to give that to you so you know who this guy is when I'm talking about his encounter with the Jinn. And if we have time, we're going to hit, he's got another encounter with the Jinn as well. But let's do just a brief recap for those of you who may have missed on Friday who the Jinn are. In Arabic, male Jinn are called Jinni, Jinni, and females are Jinnaya, with a YA at the end. They are earthbound spirits who fall into the same category as the fairies of European lore. Think of the Celtic fairies, which we're most commonly familiar with, and we see them watered down in storybooks. But if you read some of the accounts in Ireland of the fairy folk, the fae, you're going to get an idea of who this is. They live in this world right here, as opposed to the transpersonal forces that reside in the spirit world, which is kind of over there. And in the Holy Quran, the great prophet Muhammad himself reveals that the Jinn are real, that they're formed of holy fire, and that they're normally invisible. Now, by the way, when we talk about Muhammad, those of you who are not Islamic or may have a political stance against extremist Islamic religion, you're going to miss some of this stuff. And Muhammad, did we trust everything he wrote? No, certainly not. And his personal life was probably not one that I would admire. But to the Muslim, he is the great prophet. And so looking at him in that light, he proclaims that the Jinn are moral, they're capable of becoming visible at their own pleasure, but that they can also be mischievous and even troublesome to those who cannot control them, and in some writings even downright evil. And this Jinn that Wesselman writes about here in his encounter, he encountered in, as I mentioned last Friday, in the mortuary temple at Medinat Habu, near the Valley of the Kings in Luxor, Egypt. Now, I've been there 3 times. I've been to Medinat Habu, and it's a very interesting temple. It was about 10 minutes drive from John Ward's house in Luxor, and so we went there a couple of times. And we actually walked across the desert, not a long stretch, less than a mile, between some of the old temples and Medinat Habu. We just walked over, and it's right in front of on the east side of the Theban mountain range. And by mountain range, again, as I mentioned, it's not like the Rocky Mountains. It's a small range of large rocky hills that separate, that run down on Luxor on the west. And he returned to the shrine through his shamanic journey work in 2009, and then he had a most unusual conversation. Now, this is, again, a scientist who has stepped over into the shamanic realm, and he's crossed over through that door between what you would call the here and the now and the scientific, and into that world that is far different than you might encounter if you're just a historian, an anthropologist, or an archaeologist of any kind. And what's interesting is that all those things, if you're studying anthropology, going into the spirit side of things could be a natural course to take once you start embedding yourself in with some of the people and learning their spiritual beliefs. And this is what Wesselman has done. And he says, let me say in advance that this dialogue did not occur in English nor in Arabic, but rather in the nonverbal communication modality that I conceive as think, feeling. And he said, my job, as always, is to translate and reconstruct the entirety of the contact after the fact from blocks of information that I can recall and transcribe into written notes. Now, another interesting thing about this, when we think about this kind of a study, experience, and so on, that even the scientist is open to these things. You don't cancel them out simply because it is not part of the scientific method. And he talks about how during the second encounter, the genie manifested itself first as two disembodied eyeballs, and since this didn't deter him, it then carefully chose to reveal itself as a smoky humanoid form that flickered on the edges, shifting back and forth from one vague shape to another, in pastel hues of oranges and yellows and greens, with deeper core areas of more brilliant light, as its mood shifted in response to his dialogue with Wesselman. But if its etheric form was somewhat diffuse, its voice was quite distinct to Wesselman, and it allowed him to share what follows with a pretty deep confidence. And again, the Jinn, according to Arabic tradition, the Jinn is that God created angels, he created humans, and then he created Jinn. There was no devil or demon, demons or devils, but they were beings that embodied really all of the from good to bad. And they're more like elemental beings that exist here on Earth. And so after identifying himself with this Jinn and what his intentions were for being there, that was his journey work, he says, I revealed that I'd been there the day before, and the Jinn remembered this, and that he'd been in contact with the Jinn before in Ethiopia in 1995 and 96 and in Egypt in 2003. And he said, I mentioned this because upon learning that I'd had contact with the Jinn before, the genie became most respectful and even helpful. And knowing that the Jinn can be mischievous, he said, I tricked it into telling me its name. Now, I don't know exactly what he did to do this, but he said after that, he was the one in control, and the Jinn could not lie to him. And he said, I say this for those of you among my readers who know the Jinn and how tricky dealing with them can be. And so initially, the Jinn revealed that it had originally come from a place in the western desert. The name of this place meant nothing to Wesselman. He said, nor could I later find it on a map. And it had attached itself to an early traveler through that region who had eventually come to Egypt. When I asked when, the genie didn't seem to understand the question, so time seemed to be irrelevant. So when its human host had died, the genie had decided to remain near the River Nile and had taken up residence in different places, most recently in this shrine, once the temple had been released from the grip of the desert sands that had covered most of it in the interim. And when I asked how long it had been there, once again it didn't seem to understand the question of linear time. And he makes a note here that the Jinn's confusion about time is in alignment with my understanding that it is only when we are embodied in physical form that we're subject to and immersed within time, which kind of goes along with my theory that even God exists outside of linear time. It's an encapsulated thing. And so Wesselman says, when we're in spirit between lives, we are then in the timeless and timelessness. And since Jinn are without physical form, they are in fact in the realm of timeless, in which all time is now. It's all present. It's all in the now, so to speak. And the conversation that follows has influenced Wesselman's own current interests and interpretations, undoubtedly. And he said, as a scholar, he says, and I do lots of reading, yet the interwoven information that follows is compelling, to say the least, even heretical at times. So here it is for you, for your consideration, says Wesselman, recorded shortly after it occurred. And here's the conversation as it began from his notes. And we started looking at this conversation the other day and digging into it, and we had to leave off at a very early place in the conversation because we were out of time. And right now, we've really only got about 5 or 6 minutes left in this segment, but then we'll pick it up after the break. He began asking the genie if there was anything it wanted from him, which he thought was a pretty good beginning. And in the pregnant silence that followed his question, an image of the carved granite altar in front of the shrine came in my mind, and in response the Jinn's field brightened considerably, as though a pulse of energy surged through its light, and hesitantly, almost shyly, the answer came, honey. And if you remember this from the other day, I was asking for honey, and so Wesselman envisioned honey in his mind and handed him, spiritually speaking, a metaphoric bowl of honey. And the Jinn appreciated that, and the Jinn said, after that, Wesselman says that any resistance in the Jinn was gone, as it took the honey and it drank it gratefully. And the genie's name appeared in Wesselman's mind, and then, satisfied, the genie turned its attention fully toward me. Was there an energetic smile? Wesselman asked, and he says, perhaps. And the Jinn says, you humans are creators. We, the Jinn, cannot create, but we can mimic, we can imitate, and we can affect potential outcomes, but we cannot create. And there was a long, thoughtful pause, and then the Jinn says, few can perceive us anymore, and fewer still can bind us to their will. Now that I've told you my name, Great One, offered respect to me, he said, can you ask me to serve you? Because I will. And Wesselman says, I've been called by other Jinn El Kabat, which is the binder. And what qualities and abilities do you possess that might be of service to me? And the Jinn flickered thoughtfully, then answered, I can protect you from enemies, and I can inflict curses and misfortunes on those who oppose you. Wesselman said, I'm constrained in my practice from inflicting harm on anyone for any reason. Still, Wesselman thought that this genie might come in handy if a real bad guy came along or someone threatened me or my family with harm. The Jinn said, or with ill will. And he had momentarily forgotten that the mental channel was an open one, and so the Jinn could read his thoughts. And Wesselman said, how about healing work? And the Jinn's field dimmed in intensity. His answer was startling. He said, who can say what is written on another person's soul? We cannot purposefully influence their destiny without tampering with their agreement. Agreement is something we can talk about. When I spoke with and edited the book for a good friend of mine, Teresa St. Francis, who wrote that book on teen suicide and her experiences as a medium connecting with kids who had committed suicide, she spoke a lot about our agreements that we make before coming into this life, physically. So Wesselman said, agreement with who? And the Jinn said, with the higher organizing intelligences. And Wesselman said, how are the Jinn below them in the spiritual hierarchy? And the Jinn said, oh yes, some of the younger Jinn occasionally misbehave. The Watchers approach them then and encourage them in a more appropriate form of expression. Remember the Watchers from the whole Nephilim account. The sons of God, the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the Watchers. And Wesselman asks, who are the Watchers? And the Jinn says, the ones among the higher intelligences responsible for this world. We're not allowed to interfere with humans on their path, although there are some who do, as well as those who function as adversaries. Now keep in mind, this is where the 200 prefects in the Book of Enoch came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. That's, I think, what he's speaking of. And Wesselman said, I thought about some of my recent reading and asked, are those the ones that the Gnostokai call the archons, or the Gnostics, the mystics? And he used the Greek term for Gnostics. And the genie says, oh yes, some of the younger Jinn occasionally misbehave. The watchers approached them then and encouraged them in more appropriate forms of expression. Wesselman asked, "Who are the watchers?" And that's precisely where we left off at the end of Friday's show, and we're almost right at the end of this first segment before we get much further than that. Wesselman asks, "Who are the watchers?" And the Jinn says, "The ones among the higher intelligences that are responsible for this world." And he talks about not interfering. I just covered that line. Sorry, I skipped back a line. And that's where Wesselman asks if they're the Gnostics. And the Jinn says, "Oh, so you know about them." And the Jinn's field brightened, reflecting excitement. "The archons are not true spirits. They are mind beings, mental entities, many of us, who were created by humans as thought forms. Many of these function as attachments, as mental parasites." "How do they do that?" asks Wesselman. The Jinn says, "They feed on the energy, on the attention paid to them by humans. This includes the energy generated by human belief systems." We might be talking here about, of course, tulpas, entities that we create out of our minds. "But they're not true spirits," goes on the Jinn, "and they will cease to exist if nobody pays any attention to them anymore. The ones you call the archons are those that we call the deceivers. And like us, they are not creative, but they can mimic and they can take on forms in response to human belief systems." And Wesselman said, "I thought about this for some length and then asked, are they the ones we call aliens or extraterrestrials?" And on that point, we got to go out to break, folks. I'm going to be gone for a couple of minutes. Be right back. Join us for the rest of this conversation with the Jinn. Stay tuned. All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com. And come on over to the chat room, the live chat room taking place in the video simulcast of this episode over on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the chat room over there, put in your 2 cents worth, and let's talk about what we're talking about tonight. And you'll find a good family of people over there. So we left off with Wesselman asking, are these archons, these deceivers, are they the ones we call aliens or extraterrestrials? I think a very interesting question to bring in. And the Jinn didn't appear to understand the question from Wesselman. So he explained what it was and what he meant, and its response was more than interesting. The Jinn said, The deceivers can take on many forms, drawing from the belief systems of humans. And there are also visitors who come here from other places. Wesselman asked, from other worlds? Yes, replied the Jinn. Who are they and why do they come here? Asked Wesselman. They are others, replied the Jinn, and they come here as visitors. Wesselman asks, why do they abduct humans and perform experiments on them? Jinn says, they don't. That is the deceivers who do that. The deceivers? Asked Wesselman. Why do they do that? Jinn says, humans are greater than the deceivers. The deceivers that you've called the archons wish to become more like humans. They cannot create. They can only imitate. And the only power that they have is derived from humans. Humans have power, and the deceivers want that power. Wesselman asks, why don't the Watchers, as you call them, inhibit the archons, the deceivers, from interfering with humans? The Jinn said, the deceivers are not spirits. They live in the human mind, so the Watchers cannot affect them. And Wesselman said he considered this at some length and asked some more questions. He said, how long will you remain in this shrine? He's talking about Medinat Habu. Again, the Jinn didn't appear to understand the question, so I rephrased it. The Jinn replied, this is my place. Wesselman said, if I travel in my spirit form, in my dream body to this place, will I find you here? Yes, said the Jinn. Wesselman said, why do you remain here instead of going someplace else? This is my place, replied the Jinn. Wesselman said, some years ago I met a Jinnaya, the female form of a Jinn, in the desert to the south of this place. She was of service to me in an interesting way. Do you know her? The Jinn said, yes, all the Jinn know each other. Wesselman says, can you tell me her name? The Jinn says, no. Wesselman asks, can you convey my greetings to her as well as my respect? The Jinn said, yes, but you can do that yourself if you have a connection with her. Now, you know, I keep wondering about this at this point in this conversation, because as I've mentioned here, with the vision I had in Egypt and the entity that I connected with, I say entity because I don't know if he was once human or not, although he said he was connected to me in Egypt but would never leave that place. And that I could call out to him, but he would only be attached to me in Egypt. And then, of course, I had the weird photograph, which I don't know if it's connected or not. But remember, I called upon this being from here in America at one point to ask if that being could be present. And I got that overwhelming feeling that it was. So I have a lot of questions about that I have not explored. Maybe some of this conversation is explaining that. Wesselman said, I have not felt that connection with this Jinnaya for many years. The genie says, it is not in the world of spirit. All time is now. Wesselman said, do the Jinn exist elsewhere in the world, beyond the deserts of Egypt and the Middle East? Yes, said the Jinn. Wesselman said, what are they called? The Jinn said, I do not know. We are the Jinn. Earthbound spirits, we live where we wish. Where did the Jinn come from? Asked Wesselman. The Jinn said, the Jinn are manifestations of great spiritual force that the Gnostikoi called the Sophia. Remember that name, Sophia? Wisdom is what it was related to. Even Jesus talked about getting wisdom, or Sophia. The base, the part of the root for philosophy, the word Sophia. So the Gnostikoi called them the Sophia. Everything that exists on this world exists as manifestations of the Sophia. Now, we need to look into who Sophia was again. Remember her from early Hebraic writings. Wesselman said, who or what are the Sophia? Is the Sophia? The Jinn said, she is the soul of the world. And Wesselman asked, does she have a physical aspect? The Jinn said, yes, this world is her physical aspect. Who or what is the Sophia? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped while I'm reading this. Where did the Sophia come from? She came from the center of, and the Jinn used a strange term to me, and asking for clarification, I was given to understand that the Sophia came from the core of our galaxy. Wesselman asked, is the Sophia a goddess? The Jinn said, I don't know. She emerged from, the strange term that he used for the core of the galaxy, as a river. She emerged from the river of the conscious light. She dreams, and all that she dreams comes into manifestation. That means she is and then he used an unrecognizable term to Wesselman. Wesselman changed tactics. He said, do the Jinn have souls? The Jinn said, yes, everything that exists has a soul. Wesselman asked, are there greater Jinn and lesser Jinn? Yes, was the answer. Are you a greater Jinn? No. Are you a lesser Jinn? No. I didn't know if the genie was simply being modest or whether it didn't understand the question, so I asked this, who are the lesser Jinn? And the Jinn replied, they are the units of ensouled energy that are growing in their awareness. Wesselman asked, where do they originate? Jinn said, from the Sophia. She emanates, and they are products of her dreaming. Wesselman said, are they orbs? Do they manifest as orbs? The Jinn didn't understand orbs, so I elaborated about those spheres of light picked up by the flash of digital cameras. I also disclosed how our photographs, taken in the great Egyptian temples at night, often revealed masses of orbs, while photos taken away from the sites revealed few or none. This was the Jinn's response. These orbs are units of ensouled light in the process of growing and becoming more. They approach you because they're curious about you. They're drawn toward human thoughts and emotions. Wesselman asks, are they Jinn? The Jinn says, they are Jinn in becoming. Are the Jinn responsible for the crop circles we see? Asks Wesselman. Again, it didn't understand the question. When I explained, it still didn't know, but it did offer an opinion. The Jinn said, perhaps these signs are created by the higher originating intelligences. Wesselman asked, why would they do that? The Jinn says, to get your attention. Why would they want to do that? Asked Wesselman. I do not know, said the Jinn. Maybe to reveal their presence and their awareness of you and your deeds or misdeeds. Now, we seem to be coming to the end of our conversation, so I asked a few more questions. Were humans created by God? No, said the Jinn. Humans are manifestations of the Sophia. Creations of the Sophia? Asked Wesselman. No, the Jinn said. The Sophia does not create. She emanates. And does so through her dreaming. Humans create. So, are human souls emanations of Sophia's dreaming? Asked Wesselman. No, said the Jinn, your souls are sourced by the originator. It is your body that is human, with its raw, powerful emotions. Your soul is simply a soul. It is spirit in nature, and it is not human. Wesselman asked, is the Judeo-Christian Islamic Father, God, Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah, the originator? No, said the Jinn. Is it the Creator? Asked Wesselman. No, replied the Jinn. Who or what is Yahweh, Jehovah, Allah? The Jinn said, he is the arch-deceiver. You might call him the Lord Archon after the terminology of the Gnostikoi. Wesselman thought about this for several moments and asked, who and what is the Lord Archon? The Jinn said, he is the archmind parasite who's been serving as humanity's adversary and who has been operating against the humans from his very beginnings. Now, Wesselman kind of sat back and said he digested this for a few long moments, and from his readings, he would learn that this insight is in alignment with the information recorded by the Gnostics in the Nag Hammadi library found in the desert near Dendara in Egypt in the late 40s, and the scrolls that date from the 4th century. So Wesselman asks, you mean that he is not the creator, as so many humans believe and claim? The Jinn says, yes. The arch-deceiver cannot create anything, although he claims that he can. He is an archon. He can only mimic. Wesselman asks, why is he so powerful? And why have all three of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, revered him? The Jinn said they were all of them deceived by the Lord Archon. He is the arch-deceiver, and he derives his power from those he has deceived, from those who believe that he is the creator, that he is the originator, but he is not. Wesselman asks, so he's not the originator? The Jinn says that is correct. He is the Lord Archon. Wesselman says, are the archons, the deceivers, evil? No, said the Jinn. How do they operate in the negative polarity? Asked Wesselman, and this took some explaining to the Jinn. The Jinn said, yes, they encourage humans to go wrong in their behavior. Why do they do this? Asked Wesselman. The Jinn says, that is their nature. They are deceivers. Wesselman asked, and what then is the source of evil? The Jinn answers, humans. The archons influence humans to err in their behavior until they reach that point where they can no longer self-correct. At that point, humans create evil because that is their nature. They are creators, and they have been influenced by the deceivers. They are still being influenced by the deceivers. Wesselman asks, so evil did not exist until humans created it? The Jinn said that is correct. Wesselman asks, and is the Lord Archon? Is he evil? No, said the Jinn. He is the arch-deceiver who has operated against humanity as the adversary since his beginning. Wesselman asks, is this why so many religious wars have been fought in the name of religion? Is this why millions of women were killed by the church in the Middle Ages during the great witch hunts? The Jinn answered, yes. The Judeo-Christian Islamic God is the Lord Archon. It was his influence that manifested itself in humans, with twisted minds to manifest great acts of evil. He is still doing that. Wesselman responds, you mean that he still has the power to do that again? The Jinn says, the Lord Archon has no power of his own. He is not creator. He is an archon. Humans are creators, and what they create is up to them. He influences them to go into what you call the negative polarity because that is his nature. Wesselman asks, so the choice is ultimately ours? The Jinn replies, that is correct. Humans can create evil, or they can create its opposite. Wesselman asks, is that how we deal with the problem of evil? The Jinn replies, I do not know. That is your responsibility as humans. In my opinion, humans created evil now, and they must uncreate it now. Wesselman says, how do we do that? And the Jinn says, by creating evil's opposite, and by changing your thoughts. The archons live in your thoughts. They are what you would call psychic vampires who feed on the energy of your thoughts and emotions. Yet humans will always have the power that comes with choice for humans are creators. But if humans allow the archons to influence them in your thinking, you humans will choose wrongly. The deceivers take delight in violence and warfare, greed and deception, competition and denial, corruption and mendacity. They encourage humans to take refuge in what you have called the negative polarity. I like this term. Wesselman said, did we create the gods? The Jinn answered, That is correct. Wesselman asks, who or what is the originator? The Jinn said, no one knows. That is the great mystery. Wesselman asks, where is the originator? Everywhere, said the Jinn. So it is the creator? No, the originator emanates, says the Jinn. It does not purposefully create. Humans do that. Wesselman says, can we interact with the originator? Does it listen to our prayers? No, says the Jinn, it simply exists. It emanates, for that is its nature. Wesselman asks, so the originator is not a god? No, said the Jinn, it is the originator. And then Wesselman went on to ask a few last questions. He asks, is there a personal God who listens to our prayers, works in mysterious ways, and so forth and so on? The Jinn answered, yes. That is your personal God. It is your own soul, the immortal part of yourself who does not die. You humans have created it on your long journey across eternity. Unlike the archons, your individual soul aspect is a true spirit and resides always in the spirit world. It's the part of the dreaming, and as such, it dreams always. And whose dream does it dream? Asked Wesselman. Its own, replied the Jinn. Wesselman asked, so when we pray to God Almighty, we are actually praying to ourselves? The Jinn replied, that is correct. You're praying to your soul self, your higher self, your God self. This is how the real gods come into being. You ensouled humans are all in the process of becoming God's slaves. I'm sorry, God's selves. I misread that. Sorry, folks. You're becoming God's selves. And when you dream, this experience is actually your higher soul's dream. Wesselman asked, do the Jinn have God selves? The Jinn said, we are God's selves. We are spirits, and we have free will. Then Wesselman says it was at this point that this extraordinary conversation came to a close. And he said, he has had other conversations, but he recommends reference for those who want more information about the true origins of Christianity, the Gnostics and their perceptions of the archons, and especially the Lord Archon, whose name 2,000 years ago was Yaldabaoth. Now, I have no idea what any of that is because I haven't studied any of that. And he's got some recommended reading, which we can talk about, and you can find Wesselman's books on Amazon. And so we've only got a few minutes left here. Well, no, I take that back. We've got about, let's see. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left here. So what do you think of that? That's interesting that some of the information shared by the Jinn seems to reflect some of the things that we have tended to dig into ourselves, that we are gods, we are light, we are spirit beings. Our suspicions that the Abrahamic God is a God that was more man-made, that was more human evolved. Now, I'm not saying I subscribe to this and that I believe it. This is one conversation that Wesselman said he had with a Jinn, his perception of this Jinn. Who's to say the Jinn was being truthful? It was not being a deceiver. We don't know this for sure, other than it said that it wasn't. And Wesselman trusted it. So this is an interesting conversation. Now, in the last few minutes we have here, which is roughly, we got about 6 minutes left, I want to talk about this other encounter that he had with a Jinn. And this is less as a script as the first one was, and I doubt we'll even get through all this. And so we'll pick it up again tomorrow, talking about the Jinn. But he talks about his essay, Wesselman, on his conversation with a genie in Egypt. And he wants to revisit the topic here and offer yet another such unpublished encounter with a Jinn that happened in 2003. Now we're talking about, what is that, about 17 years ago. And so this episode had an interesting lead-in. Early one morning in January, Wesselman talks about how their travel group proceeded in the tour bus to the site of Edfu, south of Luxor in Upper Egypt on the west bank of the Nile. Now, I've been to Edfu, and it's a very interesting temple is there. Its massive temple is dedicated to the falcon-headed sky god Horus and the earthly son of the mystic Osiris and Isis. Now, if you had seen any of my photos from the Exodus Reality Adventure that we took back in 2014, they have a fantastic multimedia light show and sound show that takes place at night at the Temple of Horus, where it lights up all these different things and the voices of the actors. They have reading accounts of the temple and the gods and so on. It's amazing to witness, and you leave there very inspired. But it's a massive, beautiful temple site at Edfu on the Nile. And Wesselman talks about how their guide drew us through the site quickly before the crush of tourists arrived, and they made sure that they saw all the places and turning us to explore. And he said he noted that the whole complex was alive with birds, stirring up quite a cacophony of sound. And when I commented on this, our guide laughed and said, "You should be here in June, when the entire temple is taken over by the nesting falcons." And it was after we left the temple heading south toward Aswan that his encounter with the Jinn took place. He says, as we drove through the small villages and the lush farmlands with their endless rows of date palms that bracket the Nile, my thoughts were focused upon the site we had just visited. And it could be said that the temple at Edfu is about the third level of initiation, the level of the warrior. For Egyptian mythology reveals it was here that Horus avenged his father Osiris by killing Set, his father's murderer, as well as Horus's uncle. And in the positive polarity, the warrior is about power and persuasion, and the negative polarity about killing and coercion, and military conquest and dominion, and about vengeance. And as the road abruptly rose out of the farmlands and into the desert, Wesselman's thoughts shifted moodily toward a person about whom I had mixed feelings, a program director who had contracted me to present a workshop at a conference several months before. And this person had never paid me our agreed-upon honorarium, typical with some of these characters in Egypt, by the way. I've had my own problems there. And had been sending serial emails stalling me, effectively lying to me. On checking with the conference organizers, I learned that this woman had not paid most of the presenters, but had simply taken the money and run. I knew now I would never be paid. As the minibus rocketed along through the open desert, I watched the driver's prayer beads swinging from his rearview mirror while I brooded about this act of betrayal. My eyes ranged outward across the barren rocky hills, arid sandy slopes that surrounded us under the cloudless blue sky. Not a tree could be seen, not a single shrub, succulent or weed anywhere. It was now late morning and heading toward midday, and the sun-baked sand dunes and rocks were shimmering with heat like my dark thoughts. And the motion of the car and the bleached monotonous landscape had lulled me into a semi-dreamy state. And by the way, if you drive in Egypt anywhere for great distances, we drove from, I think it wasn't Edfu. We drove down from, I can't remember. When we drive from Luxor to Gebel El Silsila, John and Maria's site, it's about a 2-hour drive, and it is boring because you're going down one straight, flat stretch of road with nothing around you but sand, as far as the eye can see, and it does get monotonous. So he said that he got into a semi-dreamy state when suddenly his mind abruptly refocused. I had picked up something, a presence, a contact of some sort, he says. Something big, is what Wesselman says. And he says, imagine extending your index finger as though pointing, Then enclose your finger in the other hand and gently squeeze. That's what it felt like. Except that in this case, the finger was my mind, and the something was wrapped around it like an invisible fist. And he says, within my shamanic practice, this is a known experience, and I immediately turned and focused my attention toward the presence with a mental command expressed as a question: who are you, and what is your intention? I can tell you, folks, I had that similar experience in Rocky's car as he and John and I were driving, and I connected mentally with this character that I had met in Egypt. And I got to tell you, folks, I got to leave it off there. We're at the end of the program. Tomorrow we're going to pick this story up and talk about Wesselman's other contact with a Jinn. I hope this is interesting fare for you, and I think it's going to get even more interesting. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time. 23-hour break. Sit tight.
Mm-hmm.